And so these tools and infrastructures also completely change the institutional culture, so not just the educational, right? For example, if you look at how you would set up a classroom, the physical one, right? Like maybe you have to go get some keys, or it needs to be cleaned, right? Or it needs to be shared with others, so you need a calendar to kind of figure it all out. The virtualization of the classroom changes who is the support structure of a classroom, and it also changes, therefore, the relationship with staff. And so what we have now is the IT support being a central kind of carrier of what a classroom is and what are the sort of conditions under which it can take place. And we have kind of lost sight, and maybe they haven't lost sight of us, of what happened to this other staff. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Also to think about, like, how do we find out what happened to the person who gave us the keys and what happened to the person who was cleaning the classrooms, right? Like they all of a sudden become invisible, and we accept that condition as a part of going online. So I think there are very good questions to be asked of going online, not just as a matter of keeping classes online, but also thinking about how does the structure of the university remain coherent, accountable, and transparent, including, you can ask, for example, the people who are doing the care work in your institution, how they're doing and how things are. Now I have no way to get in touch with these people, right? And so there's a lot of question about what kind of institution we are. So to kind of think about how to deal with these changes, I'm going to start with like some very technocentric views. So there was a little blog post written by some people at Delft in answering the question, should you use Zoom, and how could you, for example, secure your communications if that's what your institution decided to go with. I am not a proponent of Zoom, but in case you're using it, I think this is an important piece to read. I think the Netherlands is very lucky because they do have SurfNet. I put information about this into the slides, which is providing infrastructure to universities in the Netherlands. They will even test tools for you and give you support. And this is really important because, for example, some of my colleagues started introducing Big Blue Button, which is an open and free software for education. It was not available at TU Delft at first. We started introducing it, but then all of a sudden that meant that my colleague was running a server which should have had a privacy policy, which should be secured, right? And which should respond to support questions. And all of a sudden, a professor is also doing IT support and data protection and what have you. So it's amazing that we have Surf for that reason. There might be problems with this institution, I do not know. But I think these are kind of infrastructures to look into. So an alternative to Zoom, which requires you to buy licenses and contribute to a company who might not support your own cultural or institutional values, is to use another free and open software called Jitsi. Jitsi can be installed again on a local instance by your IT. In this case, I included a link to the Linux users group from the Netherlands who provided it. There are many other instances that are available, and again, you can define the terms of service. You can sort of make it available for free. I mean, obviously the cost of infrastructure and IT is not free, but to its users, you would not have to buy licenses. And finally, I put in a link to Varia, which is a project that has been looking at collective infrastructures and holding meetings about this. So kind of opening up that question that Constant in Brussels, which is an arts collective, feminist arts collective, has been asking for a long time. If our tools determine our practice, how do we also ensure that our practice determines our tools? And I feel like the Varia collective infrastructure is kind of inspired and also following similar questions, and then looking at, okay, what kind of tools can we use and can we propagate to address our social and political needs at this point? So I put some links there to help with that. And finally, we also do research. I assume at Artes you do research as well. And so we also, in many ways, are very challenged in the sense that Zoom is not a method. In fact, unless a platform is really made for education, I think it doesn't necessarily have the possibilities of integrating pedagogical methods in there very easily. You have to make up for it a lot. But there's also another thing, which I don't know, I assume you're talking about it a lot, which is how to deal with the absence of material and empirical methods, right? Like how do we deal with the absence of a shared room? How do we deal with the absence of being able to touch or see, or, in ways that are three-dimensional and not just rectangles? And how do we deal with things in the absence of the public? Whatever the public means, it was always tenuous, but I feel like it's even more tenuous now. And it's also very different in different parts of the city and the world, right? The cities in the world we live in. I can say from Brussels, my neighborhood is quite easy to go outside in, although there are moments where, you notice how, especially with people who live on the streets, how their public space has completely changed, whereas and our public space has changed as well, but almost they're more symbolic of the change than the physical space itself. But I think, we've had, encounters with the police and young people here in Brussels, and that happens in neighborhoods which predominantly has immigrants and people who are paid less for the work they do. So I think there's a lot of question about, like, what is this new public and who is it available to? And what does it mean to know and learn in the absence of this public? Or what happens when so-called public is all taking place on commercial services like Zoom or like Facebook or WhatsApp? So how do those things relate? And I think that we need to be very considerate and articulate about the absence of this publicness and materiality. And I think that might have to be one of the ways in which we dispute where universities are going right now, especially with the pressure on them to keep things online. So let's go back to Zoom. I think I already answered some of these questions about what it means to, take an abstraction of the classroom and put it onto these online platforms that are not really made for classrooms. And I don't know if classrooms were ever meant to be abstracted like that. But let's say we're already on Zoom. What are the kind of privacy concerns that come along with it? So Zoom went from having 10 million to about 300 million users right now. That's a humongous growth. And one of the ways that they made it possible was to offer free services to schools. So it used to be that you could use Zoom for 40 minutes for free. Now they have removed that limit and said if you're an educational institution, primary or secondary educational institution, you get access to Zoom for free. So what this means is going up to 300 million users means that you have to have a huge expansion in your computational capabilities. And to do that, they're using the infrastructure that was made for scaling up and down, which is cloud computing. And that means costs, right? Like just as our universities have to pay licensing costs for Zoom, Zoom has to pay the cloud providers, in this case Amazon, for cloud computing facilities, which is a lot of money, right? Like it won't be very little. On top of that comes that Zoom has a valuation in the markets 29 times its revenue of the past year, right? Like so it has a way, way, way higher valuation. And at the same time, so they have to keep up with that valuation somehow. They need to show that they can deliver. Otherwise, they're like, I don't exactly understand the stock market questions here, but I'm assuming that they might lose some of their investment potential. And also just recently what came out is that Facebook is putting out a similar video conferencing tool, which is seen as a competition to Zoom. And I wouldn't be surprised if Amazon would put out one as well, right? So that means that there's intense amounts of financial pressure on Zoom. And so far they're doing well because they're somehow making enough money off of the licenses, even though the question is, does that really hold given that they're giving the service for free to many users and using a lot of cloud infrastructure in the background. So they're burning money in the background to keep those free users going. And if they don't convert to cash, they're going to have a problem. If they don't convert to cash that relates to that valuation in the right way, they have a problem. So then the question is, will they start trying to use the user data they have in unexpected ways, right? So these are some of the questions where, the privacy issue kind of looks okay. I mean, it doesn't. If you look at the articles about Zoom, they're terrible in terms of protecting people's data. But what they're not doing is trying to make money off of people's data, or at least that's what they say. But I think the pressure is on them now to basically repurpose this data so that they can make money. And exactly what that will look like, if they will pivot into being educational software, if they'll start selling user data, if they'll start showing advertisements unless you pay a certain amount of money, all of that is to be seen. So that's like one place where I would say privacy is in economics, where the economics determine what will happen with your data, and it's not about the promises of the company. Now, the second thing is that these systems, going back to the Discord example, come already with a lot of analytics because, as I said, they're business management tools or gaming platforms. So any app designer who develops on top of these platforms needs to have some statistics. And of course, these companies also get investor interest or funding by showing statistics, right? Like how many millions users do we have? How engaged are they? How much are we likely to grow? Are they going to churn? So what happens now when instructors or whoever is going onto these platforms use them for educational matters is that they can now get access to these statistics as well and then start interpreting rather freely what the statistics are. So here we have a professor, a friend of mine shared this with me. The nice things about students working online is that you get a much better overview of their study behavior, which shows basically their activities on Discord, which I'm sure this person did not ask for consent. I'm sure the students didn't know that somebody would interpret their clicks on Discord website as to whether they're engaged and their study behavior, right? Here we have literally like the production data of a gaming company being used for educational purposes. Again, like conflation of cultures and interests continuously. And I think it's really important to remember that there has been a whole industry called e-learning since 2000s. These companies have had an interest in capturing parts of educational institutions, either through their communications or their, project portfolios, or all the blackboards and all the different tools that we've been subject to now in our educational institutions. This has been a growing market since the 2000s, if not earlier. And so this was, the COVID-19 was like, was their dream come true, right? Like all of a sudden, all universities went online. And, we had a colleague who's in educational technology, and he said, my LinkedIn is lighting up. Everybody's saying my software company is an educational software company so that they can get, pitch their software to universities and catch a bit of this money that's obviously going to go out now from the universities and other educational institutions. And I think one needs to remember that the promise of online learning has always been attached to basically creating efficiencies by being able to monitor learning through analytics. So there is no online learning without using analytics and therefore control of education through a centralized monitoring service that uses this data. So yes, privacy is not in the design of online learning. So even if you got a specialized software, you might find these kind of statistics that make really absurd claims about what it means to learn or not.